Well, I might have tweeted that we had to defeat you at all costs.
Hello and welcome to the BetaKit Podcast. I'm Katie Lohr, humble podcast producer. It's our July AMA, and as always, I'm joined by Douglas Soltis and Rob Kennedy. Thank you both so much for joining me on your podcast.
Humble producer of an award-nominated podcast, Katie.
That's right. The BetaKit Podcast is currently nominated in the Canadian Podcast Awards for Outstanding Technology Podcast, along with our very special guest on this AMA and co-host of The Feed, Amber Mack. Amber, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much. And congratulations on the nomination. I'm happy to be in the same category. And it's exciting just to see all of these great shows focused on Canadian technology.
Thank you for saying that. We are not happy to be in the same category. You are going to crush us. But we very much appreciate you coming on the podcast with us as like a really fun, you made it kind of like second place, first effort type scenario. Thank you for that.
No, I think honestly, I look around at I think there's 5 finalists in the category of Outstanding Technology Series. And I know Bruno from Montreal is also in there. So it's exciting, right? I think we don't celebrate enough of what we do here in Canada. So I just love this idea that we have this great podcast awards that I believe is in its 5th year. And I think it's good for us to be a little more confident and excited about what we've been able to accomplish.
And selfishly, I am always about getting the Canadian podcasting ecosystem together. So I'm so happy to see this happening.
Not in battle, as our listeners suggested, but to answer their questions, which is its own kind of battle, perhaps.
I think you're right. I feel like they expected the sort of a hardcore kind of duke it out. That's what they were looking for, but it's really not that Canadian anyway.
No, I might have tweeted that we had to defeat you at all costs. That might have inspired a little bit of but it was knowing that you were going to crush us. So thank you again for being gracious enough to come on our podcast and honestly answer all the tough questions that Rob and I will completely avoid because we don't know what we're talking about.
I'm ready for it.
Yeah, Amber, that's the secret agenda here. They just want to throw all the questions at you. Also, it's still the beginning of the show, so things still might get heated.
Who knows? Yes.
So as Douglas briefly alluded to, we have a lot of questions that came in. So I'm just going to jump right into it. The first one being hopefully a simple one. What's the best book you've read this year?
Amber, do you want to take this as our guest first? I assume you read voraciously.
Yeah, I think the last book that I read, I believe, was Forward by Andrew Yang. I've always been a fan of his work, and it's been fun to watch him. If people aren't familiar with him, he, of course, was one of the candidates for president many years back in the U.S., and he's really interesting because he has this great, deep expertise in the technology industry, and I thought he brought a really fresh take to politics. And even today, he's moving forward with creating his own political party. So I just love this idea that he's always kind of reinventing himself. We don't see that much in politics in Canada. So it was a really good read.
Yeah, he was Mr. Universal Basic Income. I'll go next, I guess. I really like 4,000 Weeks by an author named Oliver Burkeman. It's basically a reporter who wrote about productivity and being more productive for his whole career. And then this book is kind of pooping on all of that and being like, how can you fail at being mindful? You know, you don't always have to do something. You don't have to take vacation to recharge for work. So it's just a really interesting perspective on how you spend your time. It's a pretty easy read.
I feel like that's a subtweet of what I'm reading currently, which is Rocket Fuel by Gino Wickman and Mark C. Winters, which is all about maximizing your productivity. BetaKit might be undergoing a couple of transformations right now. We are adopting the EOS system, the entrepreneurial operating system, and with that comes a lot of reading and a lot of structure. I've discovered that I am apparently a visionary, so that's been quite empowering for me related to BetaKit and the things that I enjoy doing and the things that I don't enjoy doing. But I honestly got to say, I don't often read books like this because I'm too busy drowning in a business to read about running a business more effectively. But part of what we did was commit to this process to get a better BetaKit out the door. And it's actually been pretty cool because when you read something about the way that you do business, it makes you feel less alone in making those decisions. It's like, oh, if someone wrote that down, this wasn't a thing that I pulled completely out of my butt, or they're at least encouraging me to do that. I also highly recommend audiobook in it as well, because there's nothing worse than trying to, before the close of evening, burn through a couple extra chapters about a business procedure, but on a little walk in the middle of the afternoon can be quite lovely. Katie, you reading anything?
I didn't think I was going to be asked this question, so I've tried to read a couple of books this year. I'm about halfway through a bunch of them. I was recently recommended a book by my therapist, but I'm not going to get into that. So taking the attention away from me, on to our next question. This is like the biggest topic right now, so I'm so excited for you all to dive into it. Someone wants to see a discussion on Shopify and what its layoffs and overall slow growth means for the company, as well as Canadian tech overall.
Does anyone want to explain what Shopify is?
For our listeners, I think we should note that this question was submitted anonymously, and there was like 5 different versions of this question submitted anonymously. While we had a number of submitted questions where I'm very happy to highlight the people that listen to this podcast, or at least would like to take the time to bludgeon us with unanswerable questions on this podcast, this was the one that no one wanted to put their name beside, because I think, well, 2 things. This is Canada's largest tech company currently. It is the tallest poppy. It is garnering the most attention. And it just eliminated 1,000 employees across the country, and I guess broadly around the world, which puts the level of attention on it to be quite high. I have a tendency to see this through the lens of my experience at the prior largest Canadian tech company, Research in Motion, but I don't want to run that back. Amber, I saw you were actually tweeting about this previously and kind of noting. Well, it was interesting because obviously you track this space and you know Shopify and what's going on, but you were kind of taking a personal perspective of like the people that you know at the company and what they might be going through. I think it'd be awesome if you could speak to that, because we kind of bypass maybe the human component to this before we get into the business or the technical stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. You know, you mentioned it, that it's approximately 1,000 people, and that's a significant number of people. And I guess I just can't kind of detach that number from the individual stories of people, both here in Canada and all around the world. And I heard some of those stories on Twitter. Some people were tweeting me and just letting me know that they had arrived kind of online at their computers to work that morning. And then within a short amount of time, they were told that they no longer were employed by Shopify. And I think that's devastating for anyone to get that news so quickly and to be in that situation. I mean, many people had left really prominent positions to go and work at Canada's tech darling. So it's devastating to see at this time in 2022, when we expected that company to potentially continue to grow, to have to lay off 10% approximately of their workforce. So for me, it really is about those individual stories and how hard that can be, especially coming out of 2 years of a pandemic, right? All of a sudden, you know, if you have a family, just to think that you're at the point where the job that you always wanted is being eliminated, or you're being let go. So I think it's pretty hard news for all of those people and really everybody at Shopify, right?
Yes. Speaking with Megan Simpson today, our associate editor who covered Shopify's earnings, which dropped today, day of recording, which also weren't great. And obviously we're coinciding the decision to get the layoffs out beforehand. She had noted that Toby sounded significantly sadder than he normally would on the earnings call. Normally it's kind of like highly technical, slightly annoyed that he has to do this thing. And it was a different tenor to it. But even, Amber, something you just said, like, especially coming out of the pandemic, their growth and their hiring exploded over the last couple of years. And I'm wondering how many of these people were actually added in the last 2 years, or maybe even 2019. Like in 2016, the company only had 1,000 employees. So they were, in laying off 10% of the company, they were able to lay off the complete summation of what the company was 6 years ago, which is, again, an indication of how far it's come and how far it's grown, but also how dramatic course corrections can be when you, as Toby put it, make a bet and you're wrong.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's just a reminder, right? In this world that we live in today, I think we have to remember that nothing is forever. And I think when it comes to jobs in the tech industry, I moved out to San Francisco during the dot-com boom of the late 1990s, which, had its own share of issues and companies having ups and downs. And I think it's a reminder that we all have to constantly be improving our skill set, be networking. And there's a reason that people are seeing this great resignation or reset or rethink, whatever you want to call it, because I think we recognize that, we're not necessarily safe anywhere as employees. And I think people want the freedom and the autonomy to be able to do their own thing. So hopefully for all those people at Shopify, if anything, Shopify has really defined entrepreneurial spirit in this country. So hopefully they've been able to take away some of those skills and maybe build their own businesses and see how the months and years ahead evolve for them. So it's a tough day for sure.
Yeah, and just to kind of go in a slightly different direction there, Amber, I think what's so interesting is that a lot of folks who, I think we've had this conversation on this show before. If you think about it, the last kind of economic cratering was in the 2008 timeframe. So there's a good chunk of humans who are working at these companies who have never seen a downturn ever in their entire tenure. They've worked their entire career and it's just always been up and to the right. So I think that's a bit of a shock. It's also interesting that, this isn't just a Canadian phenomenon. This is all companies across all different markets. It's just tech usually has been immune in the last decade, and it's not this time around. I wonder what that means in terms of are we on the other side of our societal digital transformation where tech jobs are just jobs? Part of the questions was about Canadian tech overall too. I think what surprised me is literally 3 months ago, there was a war for talent where people were bidding each other up and changing the person on the other side of the screen. As an employee, you could just change your employer by blinking and there's a new employer on the other side. The power was in the hands of the employee, and it pretty quickly, in relatively short order, switched where it isn't a seller's market now. Maybe it's a buyer's market. Maybe it's rebalanced. Shopify's been around for quite a long time. And so I think that it's nice to hear Toby sort of reflecting on the bets that they made as a company. And I think it was reasonable for him to assume that it would be pretty crazy. I think it's also reasonable to assume that that was a point in time of growth of our society as a result of the pandemic. So at least he's sort of acting like a human CEO, but it's just hard to lay people off. And if your company exists for more than 10 years, you're going to be in this part of the universe. And it's sad that we all have to go through it at the same time. But I think it also might mean that a lot of the smaller companies that couldn't out-hire Shopify, couldn't out-hire Wealthsimple, may be able to have access to really great talent, Amber, not just to your point about entrepreneurialism, but that might help bolster some of the entrepreneurship that's happening right now where you couldn't get that talent. And now you've got people who've built world-class companies coming to start a little earlier and kind of build those companies up and help maybe further kind of seed the ecosystem with talent.
Yeah, and full disclosure, years ago, I did some content work for Shopify. So I do know that internally over the past few years, they have been growing out the content side of their business, producing documentaries, producing social media content. So I think in the media landscape that we're in today, where there's so many opportunities for independent content creators, look at what you're doing at BetaKit, what we're doing at Amber Mac Media. I see a lot of people on social media who are part of content teams who seem to have been let go. And I hope that there's something exciting around the corner for all of them, because I think in Canada, the media landscape right now, although fractured, I think there are some shining stars that are popping up and some really cool opportunities.
Yeah. Okay. So let's tie this together because there's a lot of really interesting stuff. First, I think, Rob, you're totally right. Every company that's been complaining over the last 5 years about Shopify out hiring them now has 1,000 potential candidates. If there was one thing that you saw on social media this week, other than Shopify employees kind of posting that they were leaving or rallying support, it was every other Canadian tech company saying, Shopify employees, we would love to hire you. Here's a link, DM us, in addition to whatever work that Shopify is doing, which should make any of those recently departed ex-Shopifyers feel a little bit better. As will, I'll say, our podcast last week with Mark McQueen of CIBC Innovation Banking, who's been around since not even 2008, but the .com bubble, who knows that companies laying off 10% of their headcount in global recessions during one of the weirdest times ever is pretty standard and not something specific to Shopify. I know there's been a lot of stories published lately about Clearco. I don't want to dig into that too much. We're continuing our reporting, but this isn't one company that's struggling. It's a variety of companies. Apple has just paused their hiring as well, right? Like the most wealthy company in the world. That being said, Rob, what you were mentioning about 3 months ago, it seemed to be a hiring frenzy. I know, and BetaKit knows from its reporting, that the shoe for Shopify was ready to drop as early as 3 months ago. They had been making a lot of decisions and internally pushing for, I think, a message of like, we're going to get through this. Things are going to be fine. We're not going to lay people off, and up until the point where they absolutely had to. And I wonder if this could have been handled in a different way. And if because we've been out of layoffs being a regular occurrence for so long, that if this were a few years ago, this wouldn't have been 10% of the company. It would have been 5% of the company in one instance, and then 2%. It would have been a much slower circumstance. But I think they chose to rip off the Band-Aid slowly until they were forced to rip it off at the very end. And I think that's part of the reason why morale at the company is pretty low, because they've been told a lot of things in team meetings, all hands, which we've reported on, which didn't necessarily add up to what happened yesterday. And I think there's a sticker shock that kind of comes with that. And I just wonder, I completely agree. It's a good on Toby for owning up to the bet that was made through the pandemic and then owning that it didn't work. And now they're going to try new bets. And as a CEO being willing to make bets, like there's a lot of great quotes in Megan's story I suggest everyone listen to. But I wonder if some of this was just trying to avoid doing the hard thing that would have been easier to do had they done it earlier. And I say that as someone who's been laid off at a variety of companies in 2008 and at other smaller startups and things like that, and just knowing that it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. And I also think it's a difficult position for any executive team to be in, where they have to keep up company morale and keep people moving forward, even though maybe they know something is on the horizon. I mean, that's not an easy place to be. At the same time, I think what we've seen across the tech industry for years and years now is just explosive growth, right? And I always worry about this somewhat, again, probably from my experience in the Bay Area during the late 90s, because I think we see sometimes when you grow too fast and you move too quickly, there is an unraveling at the end of that. And so could they have slowed down a little bit during the pandemic? Could they have eased back on the hiring? I mean, these are all questions I'm sure, knowing the team, that they're asking themselves right now. But at the end of the day, I think what we're seeing is that it's just a really sad story for a company that has really been in the limelight in a positive way for so many years.
Yeah, Amber, you and I are doing a really good job not directly noting our personal dark history in previous tech eras and naming names here. So congrats to us. But there is one thing that you said before that I forgot that I just wanted to note. You had mentioned that a lot of the content people, a lot of the social people, the non-core engineering-led people have been affected here. And we noted that in our story that most the layoffs were in recruiting, support, and sales. And then Toby Lukey also noted that Shopify was eliminating over-specialized and duplicate roles, as well as some groups that were convenient to have, but too far removed from building products. And I'm quoting there, which I think is a really strong reminder for anyone working in tech, as Rob said, that not all tech jobs are created equal. Tech companies are not bulletproof, and an engineering-led company just told you who they value at their company. And I think it's a decision that most engineering-led companies and tech companies would make. I say this as a former marketer myself. This is just something you have to go into understanding.
Okay, I take it we need more engineers. Okay, so let's just dive into the next topic, which is, yet another big one. Just 5 cities, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Ottawa, and Calgary, account for approximately 70% of all digital services employment. How can we tackle the digital divide between Canadian cities, recognizing remote movement has helped?
Where we all look to Amber right now.
Well,
Clear ISO Amber.
Honestly, I think that we just need to do a better job when it comes to the digital divide that exists right now when it comes to infrastructure. And it makes sense to me that when it comes to digital services and those jobs, that they are concentrated in urban areas, because we know in rural areas there are still issues with internet connectivity. I was just for fun looking this up on the CRTC website that said that about 89.5% of Canadians have access to broadband broadband internet. But when you go to those rural areas, it's actually only about 53.4%. I mean, that's approximately 1 in 2 people in rural areas who have access to broadband internet and speeds that are sufficient to be able to do this type of work. To me, that's a total failure in 2022. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is that internet infrastructure is a critical utility for all Canadians, whether it comes to doing online school or building your business. So this feels like that thing that we just can't get right. And I know the federal government is trying and they have goals in place in terms of connecting all Canadians, but it's just not happening fast enough. And I think we have our heads in the sand if we think that it's better than it is, because we've all heard the stories of people not being able to be connected. And this is just going to limit us as a country that's able to move forward and be as innovative as we need to be right now.
Yeah. And just as someone who was born and raised in what would be considered rural Ontario, by which I think here is defined as anything outside of the Golden Horseshoe, internet connectivity is on par with the recent Rogers outage, which I'm sure we're going to get to later. So this is I also note that this question is coming from the president and CEO of the WeTech Alliance, right? Who is very interested in regional innovation across Ontario, noting maybe a bias or a special interest there. But I think it's one directly related to, we're just talking about a company, Shopify, that's changed its headquarters from Ottawa to internet everywhere because as part of its growth strategy wanted to enable any talented candidate to be able to work from wherever best suited them. The requirement to that is the kind of internet connectivity that Amber's talking about, as we all stream 1080p video at each other to do a remote podcast, because we're never going to do one in person ever again. I will maybe challenge the idea that how much the federal government has been trying versus noting commitments and maybe deploying dollars and how effective that's been. I also note, I think we're going to talk about Rogers later. We're going to talk about remote work. There's a competition question here, teeing up a second act appearance from Senator Colin Deacon maybe, or invoking the spirit of Vas Bednar. I don't think Canada can unlock its potential unless every geography in this giant country has the same opportunities as the 5 cities mentioned, because we've seen what's happened in those 5 cities due to COVID and the desire for everything's been thrown upside down. And I feel like this part, the internet connectivity, is the unfulfilled promise or required thing to really unlock that potential.
Yeah. And yet we don't hear politicians really talk about it all that much. I know that the Canadian government does have a connectivity strategy, but it kind of blew me away when I was looking this up that their plan is to connect 98% of Canadians to high-speed internet by 2026 and all Canadians by 2030. That's still, 4 to 8 years away. And to me, just using the language of these timeframes to say that, hey, it's going to take us this long to connect Canadians when we've known that this has been an essential service so long is just a total disservice to Canadians. I just got back from Prince Edward Island, where I'm from, and in 5 or 6 smaller towns in Prince Edward Island, they have fiber internet, which is blazingly fast, and they've had fiber for years. So we know this can be done, and the idea that we would potentially make Canadians wait, 4 to 8 years before we had connectivity is just a total disgrace. And we just need to do better. And I think this is one of these things where I'm surprised that more people don't talk about this more often.
They want to, but they can't get connected. I'm wondering how we can get some of our Atlantic Canada writers to the towns that you were in, because their only capacity for internet connection is to tether off of their phone service, which they are capped at in both data and bandwidth. And I don't even think the tower that they use for that is provided to them by the carrier that they pay. So there's a huge infrastructure component, and 2040. Also, what are they defining high speed as it was defined in 2016? Are we what speeds are we talking about here?
50 down, 10 up or something like that.
Okay. So the high end of Bell DSL, which they're trying to replace.
Yeah, I want to say, so the town that I was in is called Georgetown in Prince Edward Island. And if you sort of follow what's happening in PEI, which I know not a lot of people necessarily do, they tend to have a lot of access to government funds to try new things. There's a lot happening there right now. So this was a pilot project put in place a few years ago to get fiber internet. And I believe I'm just going to ask Chris, what did we get for speeds in Georgetown? Maybe 350 down. Okay, almost symmetrical, 500 off the Wi-Fi. So, pretty significant fees. I did a live multi-camera keynote, but that's just an example of a government that said years ago, hey, we need to do this and we're going to pilot this and try this. So my point is just that it can be done. It's just that we don't seem to have the will to do it as quickly as it needs to be done.
I love that this podcast is being hosted by our podcast producer, and then Amber brought her own to throw to answer questions.
He's just randomly answering questions.
Well, Katie
in the
wasn't there,
background.
to be fair.
Yes. And you probably couldn't hear Chris, but that was Chris, who is my business partner as well as my husband. And everywhere we go, we do speed tests and we get very excited and we text each other our speed tests. So it's very nerdy, I realize, but I feel like people on this podcast will appreciate that.
100%.
Yeah. So you're the perfect guest for this podcast. Okay. I was actually going to jump in because I feel like we have another question that kind of ties perfectly into this, which was, how should our political institutions respond? Should they make sure that they too have ongoing remote/hybrid experiences across their organizations in order to better understand the public policy implications of this shift?
Katie, who is this question from?
It was Senator Colin Deacon.
Friend of the pod. Friend of our award-nominated podcast. Yes. I may have bullied him into also submitting a question because he was spending most of his time on LinkedIn earlier today praising Amber Mack. And I was like, quit praising and ask a question so we can get it answered. But
hey, he's an East Coaster. We stick together. That's all I have to say.
Awesome. I guess, we were talking about the digital services employment, which relates to what we would consider remote work if we're not going to have everyone working in 5 major hubs anymore. And we've tackled there is a need for, I would love to get 500 down, 500 up. I basically pay for that. It doesn't happen, but I would love for that to happen in downtown Toronto and the rest of Canada. The question here is about how do political institutions respond? And I'm wondering if there's a capacity issue and an understanding issue internally here for 2 reasons. Minister Baines, when he was the Minister of Innovation, was a pretty big proponent of remote access for connectivity. But there was a lot of deployments in areas of Ontario which were very close to his riding. Secondly, when the Rogers went out a few weeks ago completely, it brought down most of the nation's infrastructure across banking, finance, commerce, you name it. And I laugh, but in really serious ways, like the inability to dial 911 unless you knew enough about the issue to pull your SIM card and get on another carrier service. It also brought down the CRTC. Because none of the workers there had any redundancy in their network connectivity. So I feel like our political institutions should respond by catching up to the reality of what the digital workers they're trying to raise into the middle class tax bracket have to deal with so that they can maybe actually deliver said services. Rob, not to throw the political onto you, but am I just get the net here a little bit?
I think there's something to you want to live the way your constituents are living. So you have empathy for the quality bandwidth. I mean, going back even to the previous discussion, I almost think that at this point in the universe, the internet should be a basic human right at the end of the day. And so we should all have access to not shitty internet, just like we have access to clean water. Again, sometimes a problem for our government. But the other thing too is that these things are happening quite quickly, right? So we're just catching up on how do you regulate social media? And it's been around for about 10 years and Facebook's given up on social media. And so things are happening faster, not slower. There's new concepts and ways of communicating and there's ways of interacting with each other. Like that whole social media aspect of the internet is old hat. I don't think much of our political class know how to use social media in a meaningful way to engage with their constituents, to solicit feedback. It's still email us and maybe we'll get back to you kind of thing. And then furthermore, if you turn the camera in the other direction and you start looking to the future, I think we're on iteration maybe 3 of 10 with Web3 stuff when it comes to blockchain and digital currencies. We're sort of starting to think about digital currencies, but the kind of upending that when we iterate enough and get to fruition with these kinds of technologies, they will fundamentally, once again, change the way that we interact with each other in these institutions that we trust. And if we wait until those things mature and the people who have any idea about how to legislate the stuff just have no idea and are not seeped in it in any way, shape, or form, we're going to be caught flat-footed when we can and have taken the opportunity to lead. For example, I remember Mars and Toronto did something, I think, in the age of Uber, where they actually, an Airbnb, they came up with some ideas about how to legislate the sharing economy, and they kind of open source those ideas for anyone else. We can be there. We don't want to wait until we're there. We can actually lead and not follow for a change. And I don't see evidence of that happening. So part of it is being part of, I was watching some of the hockey stuff today where the questions are sometimes coming in from Zoom, from the politicians to the people who they're questioning. That's a start, but we have to move quicker to start immersing ourselves in that sort of in the ecosystem, and not just like, all right, now we're doing some Zoom parliament sometimes. It's like, that's not, you don't stop there, you start there.
Yeah, and I think also, I realize this isn't a political podcast, but I think that we have to ask ourselves some really hard questions. We look to government to solve so many problems in our society. And right now it feels like many of our institutions, our infrastructure, I don't want to say it's crumbling, but, you can take everything from healthcare and waits in emergency rooms and doctors and nurses in terms of shortages. And then you look at infrastructure as far as access to high-speed internet and the issues that we have there. You could look at education, and there are many issues right there in terms of educating our kids and problems. So to me, it feels like the things we look to government to be able to lead on and guide us, unfortunately, they just aren't necessarily doing that job at all levels. And I think it affects us as workers, as people who are trying to move forward, as a country that's trying to get ahead. I think we're in a time right now where it feels like nothing gets done quickly. And all of a sudden we start to see that, Canada can't really be the player that we want to be if we aren't able to move on all of these fronts.
Yeah, it seems like it requires a change, not only just a greater investment in our infrastructure, but like a change in the types of infrastructure we're trying to build, away from centralized mass transit highways to downtown central cores and back to the suburbs, to more of a distributed infrastructure that supports people where they are. Because I think we would have less of a housing crisis in our major cities that were mentioned in the previous question if the distributed access of services were such that they could be living where they wanted to and still have the same access of opportunity. And I don't think that the cost of that is significantly higher than what we try to do in terms of ramming another lane or adding an extra highway or things like that. Like the distributing the infrastructure can lead to higher quality per capita. No policy expert here, but as we're getting pretty rural in our representation on this podcast, and I think it's worth noting that there seems to be, I don't know if an unintentional or just like a of the moment theme to a lot of these questions that relate to our systems aren't up with the times that we're living in right now.
Yeah, I mean, I can think in my head, I won't name all of them, but a number of politicians who I've seen out at, the openings of new roads or highways or office buildings, whatever it might be. And yet, if I try to think about any politicians who maybe are doing a tour across the country or their city or their province to talk about access to internet, to bring it back to that conversation, I just don't remember that ever happening. And you have to sort of ask that question right now, that if you wanted to win as a politician, whatever level you're competing at, if you were to go with this one thing as one of your issues, you would have the support of everybody on all sides. It just seems like a no-brainer to me. And yet these are conversations that are left out of many elections. I sometimes cover elections just in terms of the digital conversation for media outlets. And what has struck me at the federal level and recently at the provincial level is that we have candidates who never have conversations in debates about things like internet access or how algorithms are affecting our children. All of these things that are actually happening to us, they don't seem to have a very good grasp in terms of understanding the impact they're having and also leading the way to change things.
Yeah, it's funny. Senator Deakin asked another question or submitted another question saying, are there promising tech tools that can be brought into use to ensure that Canadians are increasingly politically engaged in a meaningful way? And I think that actually the answer to that question is to flip and have politics look to meaningfully engage with the current tools to reach people where they are.
Yes. I mean, I think this deus ex machina of technology tools raining from the sky and saving us is never, it's not it just never works. It's never technology. I spent a lot of my last decade doing consulting and building these tech companies and working in digital transformation. And every vertical I went to thought that the other verticals had their poop together, but except for them. So like, all the financial services, like, oh, we're not ahead in technology, but everyone else is. Then you go into healthcare, oh, we're not ahead in technology. And everyone thought they had it together and they didn't. And I don't think this is a technical problem. This is a human problem. If you even look at the study that was cited, and we do need like a FANG style acronym. Is it VOMKIT for Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, like actually Vancouver, Ottawa.
Oh no,
Toronto, we need some sort of good like acronym there. Anyway, that report was written in 2019 before the pandemic, right? So it required an act of God to cause a change in the way that we think about how we arrange ourselves. And even that might not be enough to actually pull the teeth out to actually force some sort of action. So the question is, what is it? And Amber, it's interesting that you mentioned that, you lived in the Valley. I lived in New York for a few years. And it was funny coming back to Canada where everyone's like, what's the government going to do? Nobody says that in America. Nobody waits for the government to do. Not that the Americans have their stuff figured out. Don't get me wrong. But right now it's like, yo, Starlink will save us internet-wise.
Yes.
I'm like, but that's
Elon,
a private guy
always
setting
Elon,
up things, right? Like, it's like, what it's, I think it's something about civic engagement and having people who are not just at the top end of their careers, but in the middle of their careers, actually finding value in serving the citizens that they live with, because they have perspectives and opinions that do not, by definition, don't translate into the older generation. And I'm old, and I'm saying that.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? And I think we always probably want new leadership in politics, but at the end of the day, I mean, there are a lot of people who just wouldn't want to do that job, right? And I think it comes with a set of kind of rules that many people don't necessarily want to live by. And then if you're in the social space, as much as I think politicians should engage, it's terribly toxic as well. So I think
there's one person in politics right now who's currently using technology in a rather dramatic way to rise in power. And I'm absolutely horrified at the chances of this person coming into power in Canada. So like the scale and the power of the tools, like we were joking on Facebook giving up any sort of control over what it created. Like it swings both ways. So we need a full court press on the engagement here to allow that to happen. But Rob, more importantly, just to follow up, are you abstaining from swearing because Amber Mack is on the podcast?
No comment, Your Honor.
Hey CTOs, are you endlessly building your app or website, leaving you barely any time to focus on cloud adoption? Not quite ready to hire a full-time employee to handle it either? Why not partner with Duca, an independent Canadian cloud consulting company? With pay-as-you-go pricing, Duca's AWS experts provide you with the best approach to cloud adoption and respond quickly to your needs so your business runs smooth. Keep your head out of the cloud and focus on your business by booking your free discovery call at duca.ca. That's DIUCA.ca. Katie, do you think it's time for us to talk about Rogers?
Yeah, I think it is time. And okay, on to another heavy one. I mean, okay, things are just, for us Canadians, as Amber Mack said, things are crumbling.
That's the bull quote. Amber Mack, things are crumbling on the BetaKit Podcast.
So optimistic.
On brand for this show.
Okay, so here's the question. It's from Matthew Lombardi. The Rogers-Shaw merger appears to still be on track without significant institutional or consumer opposition, even after the recent Rogers outage. So do Canadians simply not care about further consolidation of our telecommunications sector?
Do you want to explain what Rogers is for our listeners?
Amber, can you jump on this one? So on this podcast, we've had a number of conversations related to competition and the lack of competition in Canada. And it will be a theme, spoilers, of some of the stages we're programming at Elevate this September. We always take a look at it from a competition edge. I think Matthew Lombardi, who is the director of 111, is responding to the fact that weeks after its recent incredibly destructive outage, Rogers posted quarterly financials, just stacks upon stacks of cash. I'm interested, like, obviously you have a very wide angle lens perspective covering tech here, usually from like a very informed consumer perspective. I gave away that perspective years ago when I jumped to the other side. What is the average Canadian response right now to carriers, to phone service? For like, we were making the good old days of like Android versus iPhone, like before. Like, what is the normal Canadian thinking about this stuff right now?
I really think that the average Canadian right now is struggling on a number of fronts. And I do really think that oftentimes, I think many Canadians are starting to kind of put all the pieces together and understand that because we don't have real competition in this market right now in Canada, when it comes to our telcos, that they are paying a premium for services that they aren't necessarily getting. We were just joking before that, many of us pay for internet speeds that we don't get. Many people were paying for Rogers services that they didn't get for more than a day, if not longer than that. So I think the average Canadian is waking up to this reality that we're in right now, and I think they feel helpless. And I don't want to say I have a solution for all of this. I will just say that I think we need more competition. I think that we need better leadership, whether it's in government or across different industries, where people say that profits aren't everything. We want to be able to connect people to services that are affordable, and we want them to be able to live their lives. And we don't want our services to necessarily kind of break the bank. And unfortunately, we just don't have that leadership right now. It may sound like a pipe dream, but we've seen in other countries, including one south of the border, where that competition allows individuals to get access to services, including their telcos, that are reasonable, where they have good customer service. We don't know what it's like to live in that world.
Is the despair coming from awakening to the fact that there's never been competition in Canada, and they're just now realizing that like 3 companies own all the channels, all the sports teams, like everything? Or is it the despair that like the people who might be responsible for this? And I'll say again, we are the proponents of the free Matt Boswell t-shirt. The Competition Bureau is against the merger, and Minister Champagne has at least had strong words against aspects of the merger. Like, hey, you can't sell each other everything, just a couple of the things. Is the helplessness on you feel on what side? Just the fact that there's no recourse, no opposite choice, or the fact that there's no body in Canada that seems to be able to smack Rogers on the head for failing?
Well, I think Rogers in this case as well, they had an opportunity maybe when this outage happened to do a better job as far as being transparent about the situation and better communication with their customers. And that also didn't happen, whether it was on social media or in mainstream media, although arguably their customers weren't connected, so it would have been tough to communicate with them. But nonetheless, I think what we saw there was that it just feels like no one cares. And I think there comes a point with Canadians when they start to feel this on all sides, whether it's from these big companies that are taking a lot of their hard-earned money, or whether it's from the government, where we start to feel helpless. And I think that is going to lead to even further of a crisis in this country. And I don't think Canadians are as naive as people think. I think they understand that they don't have a lot of choice. And then they've been told to bundle all of these services, internet, phone, their cellular service all in one. And then that causes even more problems because their whole family is on one of these telcos packages. And then all of a sudden, they can lose service just at the drop of a dime because of an update that was made. So we just, as a country, we want to play this big game, but I think we're kind of followers and we're just behind on many fronts.
Rob, do you think Canadians are gullible?
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's the question actually was, do Canadians simply not care about further consolidation? And what I buy what you're saying, Amber. I guess what I'm wondering is Rogers just waiting this out? They're just waiting out. The people will forget that, the interest rates are going to go up, how their mortgage prices are going to go up. You're just waiting. Everyone complains about it, but then nothing happens every single time. Now, 911 went down, Interac went down. Those are things that people see as well. They're like, not only can I not phone somebody, but I can't call the police and I can't like buy anything. But I don't know. I feel like our memories are short, and it's such an intractable problem that we don't individually have agency over, that it's like, oh, it's such a terrible problem. What's that? The mortgage rate just went up. I should have locked in my variable mortgage to fix. And then like, it's one of those things where you can't do anything about it. So why fret? I think we're when you said helplessness, I feel like we're in learned helplessness mode as Canadians at this point. And there are some people who care, but I don't know if there's anybody who cares enough to actually do anything about it in a deep and meaningful way. I know we had Tony Lecavera who's trying to like buy back his chunk to take some sort of action, and that is something. But not all of us can raise a few $1 billion and make a telco.
Yeah, not all of us have sold the telecom to be super wealthy to then buy back the telecom,
the same telco,
because
or do it in the first place
to
buy
run it
Spectrum.
back.
Right, like
just the full Tom Brady. Like, yeah, we'll come back another year. I'll do this for sure.
So I don't know. This is the thing that I'm not convinced about. Where I'm not convinced that it is top of mind enough. I mean, you brought up the thing about the internet not coming up. I mean, it's the same companies who own the pipes that are not able or willing or whatever to get out to those rural areas. It's the same problem.
How does this manifest, right? I mean, this is the thing, is that like all of you, I'm tapped into the news cycle in terms of what's happening. And there does feel a little bit like there's this undercurrent right now where people are having a tough time. And so to me, it feels like, yes, maybe people feel like they can't do anything, but maybe they don't care. They have short-term memories. But how long can this go on where there are so many sort of touch points of, mini crises in people's lives where they're just not able to operate as time goes on? And that's what I worry about, is sort of this undercurrent that's happening right now. And I don't know if it sort of manifests itself in violence or mental health issues among Canadians, whatever it is. I just don't know how it's sustainable to have leaders in place who don't seem to care, and Canadians not necessarily ever getting a break, right? It used to be that we would say, oh, but we have healthcare. But now, you go to the emergency room
and they're closed
and you're sleeping on the floor, right? Yeah. We don't have those things that we used to have that allowed us to build trust. Like even our institutional trust has been broken. And I think that we're not maybe taking this seriously enough. And there are lots of distractions in the world, but at some point, the country just can't go on like this if we don't have those things that we used to be able to have trust in.
Welcome, Amber, for joining the darkest timeline community we've created amongst this podcast, because I think you're totally right. To your question, we live in a very distracted society right now for a lot of the reasons that we've discussed. And I think those distractions include our politicians who are supposed to be involved in solving these problems. But I also think we have a expectation that like problems will be solved for us. Our food will be delivered in 15 minutes. We can order a cab to our home. All of the technology we've been talking about has been creating a level of complacency with like the difficulties of logistics or proactive involvement in solving problems. And, you were framing it as like, how many mini crises are we going to have before people pay attention? I'm like, how big does the disaster have to be before people actually do something? And is that disaster just so big that we're past the tipping point? And you could frame that in terms of our healthcare. You could frame that in terms of like our democracy and like access to information, misinformation. Again, shout outs Senator Deakin, who was asking us about like reliable media sources and like verifying and just that whole battle for truth, which we're not going to get into. You could think about that in terms of the climate crisis. Like we just seem to be a society, like it took Rogers going out for a day for the second time in a year, bringing down most businesses' capacity to transact, most Canadians' capacity to get money out of their bank, the ability to call 911, and then obviously video games and porn for anyone to friggin' care. And that still isn't enough to maybe prevent a merger or have our ministers responsible really take a hatchet to the walled garden oligopoly we have in the country. So like, how big does it have to be? I can't imagine a wave large enough to crash down upon us.
Yeah, we're really roping you into the darkest timeline theme of the BetaKit podcast. Welcome. I'm so glad you've joined us.
Yeah.
Amber, I always knew you were one of us. You've always been very kind to us.
You guys, you've converted me. I mean, I have always been this optimistic person, and I came on this podcast, and all of a sudden I'm ready to cry. So
that's probably the nicest professional compliment I've ever gotten.
Well, things like seem sometimes so obvious, right? You know, sometimes you're able to look at situations and it seems so obvious, like this is the right thing to do, or we need to do this, or this needs to happen. And I find myself on a daily basis now kind of shaking my head because it feels like something's just off, right? Things that should happen aren't happening. Things that we should do, we don't do. We seem afraid to kind of, step out of our comfort zone. There are just a lot of issues right now that I think, and I don't know if it's because of the pandemic where, we're just kind of hunkering down and trying to get back to a normal life, but we never can because we have problem upon problem that needs to be solved. So to me, it just feels like as much as I want to be optimistic, at the end of the day, I also don't want to be naive about the fact that we're having a really hard time solving what should be solvable problems.
Katie, do we have one positive question?
I was thinking the same thing. We do have the question about Canadian angels that we can throw to, which seems like a fun one. Rob has something to say about it.
The 40-year-old founder. It's going to be our most popular podcast series once Rob agrees to
50 at this point. But okay.
It's all about the alliteration.
Yeah, it's the BetaKit Podcast spinoff. Okay, here's the question. Getting in front of Canadian angels is a daunting task for new entrepreneurs. What are the best ways for early stage cash flow and small businesses to get themselves in front of value add angels?
Well, thanks, Rohan, for the question.
I'm just going to quickly jump in to describe Rob's face. Not impressed.
Yes.
One-time BetaKit developer who never committed one single line of code.
Listen, like him and I are literally at the same stage with our company, so it's good that I get this question. Okay, let me try to put a different light on this. I think that those entrepreneurs who are at the beginning of their entrepreneurial journey at this point in the universe is actually a pretty good time. First of all the horsemen are out of riding around. So how many more horsemen can you get? You've got pestilence, plague. I don't remember what all the horsemen are. Famine,
Rob, this was supposed to be the
Botox.
Optimistic question.
No, hold on a second. I'm just saying there aren't any more horses to leave the barn.
How bad could it get?
How bad could it get? I shouldn't have said that. How many more pandemics could there really be at the same time? Monkeypox. What the early stage angels are actually the ones who are betting on those 10-year exits. So there's longer time horizons, and they're the ones, they still have capital that they're willing to put into it. So if you're going to venture funds, and we've heard this from past episodes of this show, can Canadian venture capitalists raise subsequent funds? Not all of them, not anymore, because there's not that much money. The next funds will be hard for them to get. But early stage entrepreneurs who are trying to get in front of angels, there are a lot of Canadian and abroad angels who do have capital, who want that long-term win and are willing to put $50,000, $100,000 checks down because it's not a huge amount for them. So I think that you can always go through the typical NACOs and Maple Leaf Angels and those sort of angel organizations. But I think at this point in the universe, since everything is online, you can find those angels and those people who are in the space that you're interested in. Rather than finding people with money, you find people in the spaces that you're in and who have been successful in business. And those people are probably angels and understand and have empathy for the spaces that you're in. So you could probably approach those folks for sort of friends and family type of capital rather than doing it in a much more old-fashioned way. You could do even angelish, I guess these days is kind of old-fashioned because you're building a syndicate. But I think there's enough high net worth individuals who have empathy and want to be in the game. And there's enough, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, fomenting of entrepreneurship in the ecosystem, that matchmaking is actually not as hard. Can it be made easier? Absolutely. Do you need to rely on those traditional institutions to get that capital? I don't think so. The one other thing I'd say, which is we say this every time on this show, is I think most good Canadian entrepreneurs worth their salt won't just be like, what are the 3 Canadian angels that I can find? They're going to scour the planet for the right humans who have the right risk appetite and have empathy in the space that they're in. Because a good Canadian isn't just building, depending on the business that you're in, you're not just building a Canadian business, you're building a global business. And you don't just want to take capital from Canadians. Not that there's anything wrong with doing that, but I think that creating that FOMO as well can also be a good way. It has often been said, and I still hear this from my American friends who are incredulous, to be successful in Canada, sometimes you have to go to the States, and when other people, or other places, and when they bet on you, then Canadians will invest. So you can use those forms of leverage because you don't need that many checks from angels not in Canada to create that FOMO, to get that kind of action now. So I think that despite all the sadness we're talking about, I think this is a great time to start a business, and this is a great time to raise early stage capital.
Rob, I love how you jumped all over that question in front of the actual successful entrepreneur we have on the podcast.
Yes. Okay. The thing that I will say is, unlike Amber, who, what I also enjoy about the notes here is that Amber Mac is president of Amber Mac Media. And that made me laugh because I'm like, it would be funny if Amber Mac was not president of Amber Mac Media. It's just like, Frank Schmilkla. You're like, what happened to Amber? We needed a president. Amber, I think you're at a different point in the arc of your career in terms of starting a business today. I don't know what you would do differently if you were starting your business today in this environment, but I think that's why I think I have something to say on it. But what's your take on it? Like, you speak to a lot of entrepreneurs. Are you seeing a similar thing, or was I full of crap and really optimistic when I shouldn't have been?
No, I mean, I think you're right. It's an exciting time to start a business. I would just say, and I have done a decent amount of work with NACO as well, and they're such a great resource. But to me, one of the things that I see entrepreneurs do a lot, which makes me sort of question the potential of their success, is that I think to myself, we live in such an exciting time right now where you have access to incredible tools and technology to start something up at a very low cost, really, at the end of the day. So wouldn't it be wonderful if you started to kind of build some momentum for what you were doing and you started to get the attention of the angels versus having kind of nothing and going out to get money? So to me, it just feels like a bit of I don't want to say a sort of a lazy path forward to just say, hey, I need money to do this, because there's so much you can do without having a lot of money on hand, or maybe even getting just a loan from a bank to kind of start something up. So you start to build some buzz for yourself. Like, what a crazy time we live in right now in 2022, where you could actually start to build something, start to get attention, start to, have a prototype without necessarily going and raising millions. So that's also a path for some people who want to put in that time and that energy and that hard work. And then, if an angel comes to you, my guess is that all of a sudden you're going to be able to get even more money potentially to invest in your business than you going around trying to get their attention for what is basically like pixie dust in front of you.
First of all, you're totally right. I think most technology companies, the problem they have is marketing. It's not technology. Anybody can build a technology company now. It's getting noticed and saying the right kind of thing, or like positioning yourself in a way that's interesting is the hard thing. It's also worth noting, I think, that there is this weird narrative where you need to be a venture-backed business to be a successful entrepreneur for some reason. And I think that is true in some cases, and that's not true in most cases. But for some reason, it's become this sexy narrative. I was in a garage and I was crying, and then I built the thing, and then all of a sudden, God came down and gave me all this money. Like, that's not, why is that a success story? Like, there's a lot of very wealthy people. Actually, most wealthy people did not make their money that way, if you consider wealth to be success. So I think that there's also that narrative that needs to get out of people's heads, to your point, where it's like, first an angel, then you do a seed round, and then you do a Series A. It's like, really? Why?
Amber, have you raised financing before? Have you been fully bootstrapped in your entrepreneurial journey, either with Amber Mac Media or other things have you done, or have you kind of bootstrapped your way through?
No, never. So when I was working in San Francisco, I worked at a couple of technology companies. One was Razorfish, which you may remember was worth a lot of money, and then it was worth nothing. And I worked at another software startup where we had raised more than $20 million and we hadn't built anything. So I probably have sort of that experience where I sort of saw people go out and raise all this money and not actually have a product, which terrified me, which kind of meant that what we have done with Amber Mac Media, we're still a really small team, a small number of employees. We have, a few full-time people and about a dozen contractors and a studio, is that we've kept our expenses really low. We're highly profitable. And that has been something that I've always wanted to focus on without having any type of investment or bank loans. People may say, well, you could have grown faster. Well, at the end of the day, I'm okay putting in that hard work and, having a smaller team, because to me, it just feels like I've seen too many people raise money and not necessarily been able to kind of follow through with the growth that was expected from them. So I don't know if raising money is right for everybody. I think, you could bootstrap and do a lot, like I said, with a line of credit or a bank loan and get up and running. And then when you have something to show, go out and show it to the world. But I don't think we're doing things in the right order necessarily now.
Just to maybe put a button on that, we were talking earlier about people who have only been in the ecosystem for a few years, who think that Canadian tech started with Shopify, might not know that they were very successful, like who might not be familiar with Razorfish, who we worked with at Research in Motion, which is a technology company from before. Like there are prior generations of entrepreneurs and tech founders who are highly successful, who did it in more difficult conditions than we face now, at least from like a financial ecosystem economic standpoint. I'm not talking like pandemic and the other stuff, but just from that standpoint of like liquidity and financing, much more difficult times. And those people are the type of people who are very much willing to put in 25K checks to entrepreneurs right now who are actually looking to solve meaningful problems, because there are billions of people in this world who will give you money right now if you could solve any one of the myriad problems that we face. Just to tie it back to that idea, it's like, make sure you're talking to people who have been around long enough to know that this isn't the worst of times. And you might actually find more capital and opportunity than you were perhaps expecting. I ran into a lot of those people in Montreal at Startup Fest, and judging by how much money they blow on a very nice Japanese dinner, they have the capital to invest in your early stage startup.
Well, yeah. And I mean, also, I think you hit the nail on the head, solve problems, right? And I think that there's just so many issues that we have that we can use technology to help solve some of those problems that existed there. And I'm someone over the years who's interviewed so many startup founders, and 80% of the time, I don't even understand what they're trying to build or do because they don't really know. And then I never hear from the companies again. So let's not pretend that because you've raised money that all of a sudden you're going to be a success. That just doesn't add up. I think, again, for some businesses, like we just need to be more thoughtful maybe about what we're building and just try to have and make an impact, right? And those companies can go a long way right now.
That's a pretty hopeful end to a podcast.
I felt that. I felt it. It felt good.
We're almost there. Final question for Amber Mac. Best-selling author, virtual speaker and moderator, president of Amber Mac Media, host of The Feed, which can be found on SiriusXM, which is pretty interesting and impressive. Where should people, because I'm assuming that none of your listeners slum their way to our podcast to be horrified by how dark we got things. For our listeners, it was like, hey, this Amber Mac sounds really cool. How can they best find you? And you're also award-nominated, soon-to-be award-winning podcasts.
Yeah. So I would say that the work that I'm most proud of right now, aside from the podcast and the business and all of that, is that every Tuesday I send out an email newsletter, and you can get it at ambermac.com/newsletter, kind of no strings attached. It's free. And that has been such a great experience for me. And we have a small team helping out with that. We're around 10,000 subscribers, but we try to tackle some really important topics there. Sometimes they're optimistic. Sometimes there are kind of stories of caution.
Good hedge.
And yeah, like that's to me is kind of the space where I get to sort of put my head down and write about what I'm thinking about. So that would probably be the best place to start with.
Would you be willing at some point during your victory lap, perhaps shortly after your victory speech, to return for a future AMA, or have we completely soured the experience for you?
Oh no, I want to return, but you guys have way more confidence than I do in winning this award, because I think that it's anyone's game right now in terms of the finalists. So I feel as though I'm going to kind of curb my hopefulness about winning this award as Outstanding Technology Series, and I would be happy to see you guys win. I would also be happy to come back on the AMA anytime you want. And I think you guys are doing fantastic work at BetaKit, really important reporting on the Canadian ecosystem. And we do need more of that. So thank you for all that you're doing as well.
Thank you. That's very kind. You've definitely been the nicest guest we've ever had on an AMA, for sure. The BetaKit Podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.